Well, good evening, everyone, and welcome to another edition of the Briancrombie Radio Hour on Saga 960. So, just going through Instagram, I came across a fascinating sex therapist and psychologist, and some very innovative ways that I guess she's, number one, trying to advertise herself and promote herself, but number two, provide information that was incredibly interesting and helpful through TikTok and Instagram. What do you call them? Video feeds. And they're funny and they're engaging. And so I had to reach out to Dr. Kate Balestrieri, who has joined us from Los Angeles. She's a sex therapist and a registered psychologist. Kate, welcome to our show. How are you?
Hi, Brian. Thanks so much for having me on your show. I'm really excited to be here. How are you?
Very well, thank you. So, your resume is extremely impressive. How did you get into being a sex therapist and a psychologist? Tell me a little bit about your background, if you could.
Yeah, of course. So I'm a licensed clinical and forensic psychologist, a certified sex therapist, and I've got a few other letters after my name that I won't bore you with right now. But I really got into this field because early in my work, I started working in prison systems with violent sex offenders and also with non-sexual violent offenders. And I was really struck by the complicated relationship that people had to sexuality, to emotional intimacy, relational fluency. And as I emerged out of the prison systems and started working more in private practice, I was continuously just amazed by the complexities of sexuality that came into play in people's presenting problems. So I really decided to focus and specialize more in understanding that intersection of mental health, relationships, and sexuality.
What do you mean, sort of how it complicates things? So, explain that if you could.
So, we all have our own unique understanding of what sex is and who we are as sexual beings. And that's shaped by so many different dimensional and implicit conversations that are often happening in our lives societally, messages from our family, messages from our cultural and religious um, passing alongs, peer groups, what we see in the media, everything influences our perception of sex and our relationship to it. And then in turn, how we view ourselves as lovable, worthy, and permissible creatures on this planet, permissible in terms of accessing pleasure and being able to advocate for our own needs. So it's a pretty nuanced dialogue that's always happening. And very few people are given the tools, the permission, the context, and the vocabulary to really understand that. So we kind of are just bumbling around in the dark, I find. So it ends up causing people a lot of problems in their relationships, in their ability to date in a way that is meaningful for them. Yeah.
It
So
seems like a lot of your posts are about getting rid of the pressure of society's interpretations or definitions of a sex or sexuality. You had a post about ethical porn. You had a post about masturbation. You had a post
Mhm.
about. I loved it. I can't remember exactly what you said, but you said if a billionaire can use a vibrator, no, if a billionaire can. What was that line? It was so
I said,
funny.
if a billionaire can buy a vibrator to get himself off into space, you can buy a vibrator to get yourself off in the bedroom.
It's a great line.
Thank you.
I apologize for not remembering it as perfectly as you stated, but it
Oh,
was
it's okay.
wonderful. Um, why is it? Is it that religion, society, parents have just given us a whole bunch of hangups?
I mean, unintentionally, yes. I think that most parents are doing their best, and most of us are immersed into the cauldron of culture that we're born into, and we don't necessarily question how we've come to know certain truths. So we just assume that they're true. And what I've learned in doing all of this work with sexuality and mental health is that there are actually a lot of things that have been a lot of truths, and I'm putting that in quotes for people who can't see me, that really are constructed, and they're rooted in tremendous bias, tremendous fear, and in really, really old patriarchal systems and oppressive systems that had good intentions when they were organized, but have become just devolved, honestly, in their function in society. So now what we're left with is a lot of arbitrary shaming around sexuality and a lot of unconscious conversations about who has the right to be sexual and in what ways. So barring, non-consensual interactions, a lot of the work that I'm trying to do and promote on social media is getting people to understand that sexuality is complex and our relationship to it is complex. But if we stop shaming ourselves and everyone around us, we might actually feel a lot more at ease and at peace with ourselves, with our relationships, with our sexuality, and collectively as a culture. We weaponize sex a lot.
We weaponize sex?
Oh, yeah.
How do we weaponize sex?
Well, we use sex as a way to communicate all kinds of unmet needs, unmet relationship needs, unmet needs around power, control, a sense of worthiness, and to abate a sense of scarcity. We really weaponize sex to communicate all kinds of other human contexts. So when we take sex out of that holster, what we actually do is redefine our relationship to it, which right sizes it and allows us to do what it's supposed to do, right? Procreation, pleasure, connection, fun, creativity, spontaneity. And we can actually give ourselves permission to get our needs met in other ways without making sex that weapon.
Hold it. That was a great list. So most people think sex is about fun and procreation. You had a whole list. What was that list again?
Oh, I don't know if I remember everything I said, but spontaneity, creativity, fun, adventure. It allows us to access different parts of our personality. When we think about the role of fantasies, we get to play out different parts of ourselves that may not feel accessible in the real world. So, I mean, I think about sex as play for adults in the same way we might think about a sandbox as play for kids. We get to be creative and we get to be messy and we get to color outside the lines a little bit and see what lands.
And connection was one of the other ones that you mentioned, which is obviously critically important.
Yes.
We're chatting today with Dr. Kate Balestrieri. Is that correct?
Balestrieri.
Balestrieri, I apologize, who is a licensed psychologist and sex therapist. She's calling into us from Los Angeles, I think, tonight. What a pleasure to chat with her. We're going to take a break for some messages and come back more in just a minute. Stay with us. Welcome back to the Brian Crombie Radio Hour on Saga 960. We're chatting tonight with Dr. Kate Balestrieri, who is a licensed psychotherapist and a sex therapist. And I think you got a recognition as one of the top 20 psychologists in the United States. Is that correct?
Yes. Wow. Thank you for mentioning that. I was so honored. I think it was in Yahoo Finance for 2021. I was noted as one of the top 20 psychologists to follow this year.
And congratulations on that. And I've got to say again, your Instagram page is fantastic, and you review a whole bunch of different issues. And maybe we'll go through a lot of them. But I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about some of the services and things that you talk about, and some of the therapies and answers that you provide. And you do individual therapy and couples therapy and teletherapy and sex therapy. And in the sex therapy, you've got a whole section that I was interested on sex addiction. Tell me, what is sex addiction versus just high libido?
Great question. So first, I want to just say there's no diagnostic criteria right now in the United States manual, the DSM-5 for sex addiction. Internationally, there's recognition of a compulsive sexual behavior disorder. So there's some controversy in the US about whether or not sex addiction exists. So I'm going to use the language compulsive sexual behavior to sort of step out of that debate. And it's helpful to think a little bit around the idea of compulsivity when we're looking at the difference between somebody with a high libido, even somebody who identifies as being hypersexual, doesn't struggle with compulsivity. So the difficulty to stop when they want to stop. And I think that's one of the hallmark features of what some people would call sex addiction, but really what we're thinking of as compulsive sexual behavior. I've tried to stop. This behavior is not healthy for me in my life because it's leaving negative consequences, whatever those may be, in a person's life. And no matter how hard I try, I can't stop doing it. And that to me is indicative of a really big shift and a pivot from behavior being healthy, constructive, pro-social, pro-relational, and I don't mean necessarily pro-commitment, but mutual, and the person being in control of their relationship to sex versus their relationship to sex controlling them and spinning them out. And I think that's really a key indicator that there's a problem here.
What's the difference between pro connection and you said you didn't mean pro commitment? What's the difference with that?
You can have a really, intimate connection with someone, even in a casual sex experience. And I think sometimes what gets lost is the opportunity to honor someone's humanity because we mistake the term connection for this long-lasting commitment, maybe marriage and children and, mortgage and all the things that come with that. So what can happen is people de-emphasize connection and they start to have less humanized, less mutual sexual interactions when they're casual, saving these more intimate, emotionally connected moments for a partner with whom they want to commit. Now, I'm not suggesting that every casual encounter needs to be ripe with connection, but they can exist and they're not exclusive.
Fascinating. I read a book called Erotic Capital that said that 10%
Mm-hmm.
of the population had not hyper, but extremely higher libido than the
Mm-hmm.
balance of the population, and almost described that was a strength rather than necessarily a problem that would be described as sex addiction. Do you agree with that?
Impressed. I'm so impressed that you've read that book. Most people don't even know it exists. It's an excellent book. That's great. Yes, that's really sort of the whole argument for saying sex addiction isn't a thing. But where I come in on this, and other professionals might agree or disagree with me, what really again is that fundamental difference between being a really healthy high libido and something that can be constructive in someone's life is the difference between I can say no when I want to and I can't, right? When
So the
it's
way that it was
governing you.
described once is that you almost get the withdrawal symptoms and shakes and things like that you would
Yeah.
if you were an alcoholic without alcohol or a cigarette
Mhm.
smoker without cigarettes. Is that true?
Well, people who are active in the sex addiction community would absolutely say that's true. And there are some studies that suggest, yes, there are post-acute withdrawal symptoms, certainly changes in mood, a lot of irritability, a lot of frustration, sometimes changes in sleep and appetite, and just sort of the nervous system arousal, right? A baseline level of arousal that exists in the body can be impacted when somebody is without their primary coping strategy, which is what for many people sex becomes when it becomes compulsive.
Coping strategy for what? Dealing with just problems in life?
Really managing and regulating their emotions, right? Which again can be very healthy. When it stops being healthy is when somebody's not able to stop behavior that is causing damage in their lives.
Fascinating discussion. How do you solve sex addiction?
Well, usually it starts with each person defining for themselves what they would like their sexual behaviors to look like and which behaviors for them, according to their value system, are no longer something they think are healthy for them. And creating some containment and support around those behaviors and helping to teach them how to implement other coping strategies so that they can have a really healthy, thriving relationship with sexuality again in a way that feels contained and allows them again to stay in that, governing position of their directing their sexual behavior as opposed to the sex is directing everything in their lives.
They're directing their sexual behavior rather than the sex directing them.
Right.
Really,
Right.
that's interesting. And if it's not sex addiction, but it's just this high libido, is there a solution to that? This book, Erotic Capital, suggests that there's this huge difference between men's appetite for sex and females' appetite for sex, and almost was suggesting that the only solution was decriminalizing prostitution.
Well, I actually would be in favor of that tremendously, because I think what we are seeing right now is that there are a lot of industries where people are using their bodies for hard labor, and sex work is one of those industries, but it is criminalized because of the punitive relationship that we have with sexuality and all of the shame that we started this interview talking about, right? So here's an example of how everyone involved in sex work seems to be criminalized, but particularly women who are sex workers and non-binary folks are really overly punitive, treated in punitive ways and pejorative ways because of the stigma that's attached to sex for these groups of folks. So I would love to see it decriminalized and regulated so that people could engage in sex work safely from all angles. To your original question, though, in the book Erotic Capital, where they're talking about a high libido, how do you fix it? My counter question would be, why would you need to fix it? I don't know that you need to, because there's no problem unless it's a problem in somebody's life.
But if there is a dramatic difference between the libido of one partner and another partner, how does...
There is actually more research to suggest that there are a lot of gender constructs that go into understanding the reasons why some of those differences, stereotyped differences in libido might be true. Things like domestic and emotional labor that women tend to have put in their laps more often than their male counterparts in straight relationships. And when we factor and take into consideration those kinds of variables, we actually see that women do have a lot more arousal than they're given credit for and higher libidos. But we have to rebalance the way that we relate to each other. And when we do that, couples are a lot happier. There's a really great book out there called something to the effect of Why Women Have Better Sex Under Socialism. And regardless of your politics, I think it's important to think about just what it's saying. When we create a more egalitarian construct, guess what? One person's libido is not dampened down by all of these other domestic, emotional, and household tasks. And then we couple that with the idea that women are totally given these messages that their sex is only to be enjoyed in service of procreation or with their partner, whereas men are socialized often to be more celebratory in their sexual arousal. And it's part of what, many men will, hold on to as like a definition of their masculinity, right? The sexual virility. So we're socialized in these really different ways, but when we stop doing that, we have a lot more room for libido equality.
Libido equality, fascinating. One of the other topics that you spend some time on, both in your website as far as one of your therapies, and then also in your Instagram, is the issue of porn. And on your website, you talk a little bit about services that you provide for people that are addicted to porn. But then you also have, and I was interested, references to, I guess, the good part of porn, and you call it ethical porn. Tell me about porn, both the good and the bad, if you could.
Absolutely. So, 10 years ago, if we were having this conversation, I think my perspective on this would be very different. So I'm introducing that to say that we have to take into consideration the context that we are raised in and the attitudes about pornography that we've been given to start. So I offer that as a foundation here because porn, just like alcohol, just like truffle fries, it's not the problem. It's our relationship to the medium that can be very healthy or destructive on individual levels, relational levels, and then certainly collective societal levels. So when it comes to porn addiction or compulsive porn use, all of the same criteria that I mentioned before would come into play here. Is someone trying to stop because it's having negative consequences in their life and they would like to change that, but they can't? That's when it maybe is time to look at, can I redefine my relationship to porn? But in terms of, thinking ethically about porn, one of the things that's really important to consider is the overlapping industry of human trafficking that exists in the porn industry. And when we can stop to really kind of think about how to make sure that the erotic imagery and the erotic mediums that we're creating are done without the exploitation of others. This is where the idea of ethical porn comes into play. So how do you know that there's consent? The producers of porn, how are they ensuring that? How are they talking about it? How are they keeping their actors safe, medically, psychologically, socially, financially? There are tremendous accounts of financial exploitation in the traditional porn industries. So the article that I wrote for Jimmy Jane, excuse me, about ethical porn was really a call to action for people to be ethical consumers of their erotic imagery so that they can rest into it and enjoy it without fear that they are participating in human trafficking, for example, unknowingly, or, the exploitation of others.
I saw a Instagram video that you did on something called the Cartman Drama Triangle.
Yes.
And it was interesting. Tell me about the Cartman Drama Triangle, because lots of relationships have lots of drama.
Well, exactly. That's Cartman's whole philosophy. So Cartman, Karpman, drama triangle is something people can Google to get a better understanding of the model. But essentially, he talks about how power is weaponized in relationships and how when we don't feel comfortable asking for and receiving asking for our needs to be met directly and having that happen, right, seeing the fruits of that labor, we then develop indirect ways of communicating, and usually it's through the jockeying of power. So there are three positions on the triangle: that of the victim or martyr, that of the perpetrator or offender, and that of the rescuer or enabler. And each of them assumes either a one down, one up, or two up position of power, and all have these unconscious psychological narratives that keep them safe in relationship, albeit in dysfunctional or unhealthy relationship patterns. But we've all been on the pattern. We've all been on the triangle at different stages in our lives. So once you do a little bit of research there, it's easier to get on what is called the circle of restoration. So stepping out of
the circle of
restoration.
Restoration, okay.
Yeah, where we take accountability for our actions, we step back into an egalitarian position where we're all, equal and interdependent, and we can be direct and negotiate to get our needs met appropriately.
But the way that I understood it is that you had sort of an inverted triangle, and the victim was at the bottom, and you had an enabler at one end, and you had almost, it sounded the way you described it, like a narcissist at another end.
Well, people with a narcissistic organization can jockey around that triangle like the best of them, just like all of us can. And most of us have a default position, at least in certain contexts. But definitely the perpetrator or offender role is somebody who is more overt in their power play. And they might engage in more deception. They might engage in more manipulation, sometimes physical intimidation or aggression. They might act out in other ways. Whereas somebody who's in the victim role tends to lean more into learned helplessness and disavowing or giving away their power. They get to stay safe by not having to be responsible for everything, but then they also get angry that they feel disempowered. And the person who's in the enabler role gets to feel safe by engendering a need, right? You won't leave me if you need me. So just follow me because I know what's good for you and I can take care of it, is kind of the underlying dialogue.
We're having a fascinating conversation tonight about, I guess, sex and sexual dysfunction, etc., with a sex therapist and psychologist, Dr. Kate Balestrieri.
Nice work.
Thank you. I apologize. And am I right? You're calling into us from Los Angeles?
That's right. I'm in Beverly Hills right now.
Fantastic. Thank you so much for joining us. And as I mentioned, defined by Yahoo Finance or somebody as one of the top 20 sex therapists and psychologists in the United States. And so congratulations on that. We're going to take a break for some messages and come back more with Dr. Kate in just a minute. Stay with us. Welcome back to the Brian Crombie Radio Hour on Saga 960. We're chatting tonight with Dr. Kate Balestrieri, who is a psychologist and a sex therapist in Los Angeles. She's got offices in, I think, Chicago and Dallas as well. And she has a very active Instagram account. She blogs. Her website really is quite fascinating. I presume you're on TikTok too, as I guess, because that's where you get these Instagram reels from.
Yes.
Dr. Kate, you've got an interesting section in your website about sexual dysfunction. And you say, at Modern Intimacy, we're not huge fans of the word normal. Each person has their own relationship with sexuality, sexual wants, needs, and limits. Instead, if you think you or your partner might be struggling with a sexual dysfunction, try asking yourself if what you're experiencing is negatively impacting your relationship and intimacy with your partner. If the answer is yes, you might be dealing with a sexual dysfunction or desire disorder. A sexual dysfunction essentially means that there is some aspect of the sexual experience that is not happening in the way a person might want or believe it's possible for their body. What's a sexual dysfunction? It almost sounds like you don't think there is sexual dysfunctions unless it messes up with somebody else.
No, yeah, I think that probably needs a little clarification on the website. A sexual dysfunction is really when somebody's body is not cooperating in the way that they would like for it to cooperate. So examples of that could look like vaginismus or dyspareunia, which refer to pain during vaginal penetration. It could look like early ejaculation or erectile dysfunction or delayed ejaculation. Difficulties with orgasm. So those are some of the diagnostic categories of sexual dysfunction.
What's if I apologize for interrupting, what's delayed ejaculation? I've never heard of that.
So delayed ejaculation occurs when somebody's orgasm is not happening, within a time frame that they feel comfortable. Much in the sense that early ejaculation is the same; it's happening faster than they would like it to. Now, I think part of why the language about sexual dysfunction on our website is the way it
that
is.
was stamina or something like that.
Not necessarily. No, I mean it's. For some people, it extends beyond a degree of stamina then feels okay for them, right? And no matter how diligent they are in trying with a partner, they're not able to get their body to go there, and so it can cause a lot of frustration. So that's really a hallmark feature of sexual dysfunction, is that it causes distress for a person. Okay. But what we talk about on the website in terms of let's question if it's really a problem is really to honor that there's significant diversity about what our bodies can do and what is considered within normal limits from a biological perspective and a potential perspective. But a lot of people will compare what's going on in their body with the perception of what they think should be happening based on things they've seen in porn or stories they've heard their friends tell, and they're judging themselves with an apples and oranges measurement, and not really honoring the diversity of bodies and times in our life when there might just be other things going on that get in the way of us being sexual in the way we might want.
So people are different.
Yes, thank you.
You're a sex therapist, and on your, I presume in your practice, but also on your Instagram, you've got a bunch of or several sort of how-to things. And so I wanted to walk through some of them if we could. One of them is tantric sex. Tell us a little bit about what tantric sex is, if you could.
Yeah, of course. So tantric sex really is, it's rooted in Buddhist and Hindu philosophy, and is really about joining and being connective in a different way. And different practitioners might have a slightly different lens on this, but I really think about it from an embodied and a spiritual perspective. And when I say spiritual, I don't necessarily mean religious. I mean kind of just, a greater experience than yourself here in the moment. So it's about either during solo sex or in partnered sex, really being connected and slowing down to the sensory experience and getting almost in a bit of a meditative state. So if you think about it, it's kind of where yoga meets sex.
Yoga meets sex.
Less vigorous sometimes, and it's really slow, and can be incredibly erotic because of the intensity of focus to the sensory experience and that rhythmic movement that can come with syncing up your breath and your body. Again, either for yourself during solo sex or with partners. And the focus is not necessarily on orgasm or even on penetration, but it's about creating arousal and potential for pleasure through this, deeper connected spiritual and meditative trance state.
So I still don't understand. What is it? It's just slowing things down?
I mean, yeah, in simple terms, it's slowing things down and it's aligning rhythm, right? And being very embodied and aware of the senses and the entire sensory experience that's in your body, and really creating an expansive space for your consciousness to be focused on that.
Okay. What is sensate focus?
So, sensate focus is a style of, it's a technique used in sex therapy often that helps couples to slow down and establish safe touch. Um, and what I mean by safe touch here is that it's often used for people who have struggled with a sexual dysfunction or have a history of sexual trauma. And it's really useful in helping people stay safely embodied, which can be difficult if people are really anxious about their sexuality or their sexual um, functionality in the moment, or if they have a history of feeling unsafe in sexual situations or in their bodies. So, sensate focus is about gradually increasing the kind of touch from non sexual to sensual and then sensual to sexual in a very slow and sort of methodical way so that people can build up a sense of interoceptive awareness, so awareness of the cues in their body that say this feels okay or this doesn't feel okay, and then they can communicate that with a partner.
You also have a section that I found interesting about masturbation with a partner.
Hmm.
Is it normal?
It can be, yeah. I would say there's nothing morally wrong with it. Every couple gets to define the boundaries of their relationship in a way that works for them. So, some couples love to masturbate simultaneously with each other. Some couples love it when their partner engages in solo sex separately, and then they talk about it, and it's part of their turn-on plan together. Some couples celebrate each other doing it and really don't want to know about it, aren't super bothered by it. And for other couples, it might actually be something that feels uncomfortable for them because maybe there's been a betrayal, or maybe it's getting in the way of intimacy with the partners. So, I mean, every couple gets to define that for themselves.
You've got a post that is kind of provocative and interesting called Power to the Pussy. What was that?
Well, that's probably my favorite t-shirt. It's a t-shirt that I got many years ago at this really interesting art show. But power to the pussy, and I think the essence of this t-shirt and also the post is really a conversation starter for understanding the way in which women are often separated from their sexuality and shamed for it, which creates a lot of frustration for people. And I think one of the things that I mentioned in that post is that when we stop shaming women for being sexual, what ends up happening is there's not as much sexual scarcity available for people. So that means that we're less likely to engage in like cat and mouse games with each other around sexuality or gatekeeping strategies, because women don't have to protect their identity. If they are sexual, they can just be sexual, and that could be okay. Whereas when we shame women for their sexuality, what we're actually saying is this very natural biological part of you is bad or wrong, and you have to be ashamed of it. So it perpetuates this idea that women can't give sex away as if it's a commodity. This is another example of that weaponized sex, right? So it creates this exacerbation of men, if we're talking about straight relationships, feeling like they need to try to get sex, get laid, And it leads to a lot of coercion, manipulation, and duplicitousness and fear around, if I give this away, what's going to happen to me? So this post is really about, giving permission to women to let sex be a part of who they are without apology, and asking everybody else to do the same because it benefits everyone to empower women sexually.
We talked about sex addiction. On your website, you've got something called love addiction
Mm-hmm.
and love avoidance.
Mm-hmm.
Is there such a thing as love addiction?
Well, again, I think it's kind of a colloquial term, but it really is, it's a concept that speaks to really exacerbated attachment wounds, both love addiction and love avoidance. So when we didn't get adequate caregiving in our earliest years on this earth, really between 0 and 18 months or 0 to 36 months, depending on the model that you look at, we learn to be more anxious in relationship or more avoidant in order to try to stay safe. And what can happen when people's attachment needs are not sufficiently met is they can become more and more polarized in, needing it, seeking it, wanting it out, wanting it, and needing it to validate a sense of safety for them, versus avoiding intimacy, avoiding connection, avoiding relationships because it feels overwhelming, engulfing, threatening. And I'm sure many of the listeners today can relate to this. Those people tend to find each other, the more anxiously attached, the more avoidantly attached folks, because there's something that they see in each other that feels interesting and different, and also something that feels familiar, usually with their earliest caregivers in their family. So it can be a really frustrating dynamic for folks to be stuck in, but we do a lot of really great work helping people heal those early relational wounds and traumas so that they can go forward and have thriving, intimate lives with folks.
Another term you have here is sexual anorexia. What the
Mm-hmm.
heck is that?
So, sexual anorexia is a term that is born out of the sex addiction camp of clinicians, and it really refers to a high level of shame around sexuality and a lot of deprivation around sex, either for oneself or even sometimes, if we think about externalized sexual anorexia, there's an expectation that others should deprive themselves too. But really, it speaks to an obsession with sex, but also a deprivation around it. So avoiding it at all costs, but thinking it's gross and wondering what would happen if you were sexual. And it's sort of the other side of the coin with compulsive sexual behavior, in that there's intense preoccupation, but with, sex addiction, if you want to call it that, there's that compulsive behavior and almost indulgence. On the other side of that is
Stay away.
restrictive. Yeah. So when we think about disordered eating patterns, we sort of have a similar, overindulgence versus restriction. And that is a helpful way to kind of think about the obsession is the same, but the behavior is maybe a little different.
Fascinating. You talk about the pandemic dampening libido. Do you think it
Mm-hmm.
actually did?
I do. Yeah. I think there were a lot of couples in the pandemic and a lot of single folks whose libidos went out the window. And I think that exists for a couple of reasons. One, there were a lot of stressors. There still are a lot of stressors and a lot of unknowns with the pandemic. So people are feeling really taxed, and sometimes it's hard to feel arousal when we don't know what's going on in the world. Depending on where you live, there's been a lot of political unrest in the last year and change too. So there's just a lot that's going on in people's worlds that compete with, this idea of being sexually vitalized. But for other folks, that stress actually can feel more sexually vigorating, right? Everybody's a little different there. But the other variable for couples is like being in quarantine and being stuck together all the time and not having enough texture in your lives to go away and reunite and have something new to talk about. So work with a lot of couples who saw each other in the same sweatpants every day, doing the same thing. And
They got bored with it.
yeah, exactly. We need a little bit of air to create sexual vitality.
On your website, you got a whole section dealing with trauma,
Mm-hmm.
the impact of trauma on the brain, sexual, emotional, physical, financial, spiritual trauma, healing from trauma holistically, um, narcissistic, toxic relationships, betrayal trauma. Sounds like a lot of problems.
Well, there are a lot of people who get very wounded in relationships, right? Because of that weaponization that we talked about before, weaponization of sex, weaponization of power, weaponization of financial resources. When we aren't able to communicate our needs directly, we end up hurting other people. And there are often a wake of wounds that people are healing from as they move forward in their lives. So, we try to work with people around whatever pain points they have and help them to move from a place of pain to a place of restabilization, and then from there to a position of thriving and really reaching your potential, whether it's in work or in relationships or, otherwise. So,
I know someone who was raped.
mm,
That has stuck with them for a long period of time. How does one get over that?
it's a great question. Um, I want to really be careful here not to suggest that it's a switch that gets flipped, right? I don't think we get over traumas a lot of the time. We learn to heal in the sense that we learn how to assimilate the experience into our way of being in the world, and we learn to cope with the emotional distress and fears that can feel really big and difficult to moderate in the immediate after effects of trauma. So when we really get clear on how any particular trauma, especially sexual trauma, has impacted us across all the different domains of our lives, we can start to make more sense of it. And then we can start to step into a place of empowered choice making. And that's where people really start to see change.
But how do they do it? Do they sit down and get on a couch and talk to you about it? Or do they do hypnosis? Or do they do psychedelics? Like, what's the solution?
You know what? There are lots of different ways to heal, and I would be remiss to suggest that there's one appropriate way because everyone's needs are a little different, everyone's impact is a little different, and what works for each person is a little different. So sometimes talk therapy is a strategy that takes person to a place of resolve. Sometimes people benefit from more of a somatically oriented therapy or a body-based therapy to address some of the implicit dysregulation in the nervous system and the body as a result of trauma. Sometimes it's a combination of both. But I'm so glad you mentioned psychedelic treatment because those are actually taking off right now. And there's a lot of research to suggest that psilocybin guided treatment and MDMA guided treatments can show some very promising, and ketamine treatments can show some very, very promising efficacy for PTSD, anxiety, depression. I mean, there are just really great studies going on right now that are hopeful.
You also have a whole section on betrayal and infidelity.
Mm-hmm.
How do you get over that?
Well, I mean, very similarly, and whether somebody decides to stay in the relationship where there was a betrayal or not, really one of the tasks of recovering for them is going to be around setting different boundaries for themselves, learning how to listen to themselves and trust their intuition and, um, advocate a little bit differently. And really, it's about helping those folks step into a place of, feeling like they can be in their bodies, they can trust themselves and their partner again. And it's sometimes a very difficult process, especially if they stay in the same relationship. But with sexual infidelity, I want to highlight that a lot of the research indicates it has as significant an impact on someone as a sexual trauma would. So it's a real deal, betrayal trauma, and people can heal in lots of the same ways we just talked about.
We're having a fascinating conversation tonight with Dr. Kate Balestrieria.
Balestrieri.
Balestrieri. I apologize.
Okay.
A licensed clinical psychologist and a sex therapist. She's calling into us from Los Angeles. She also has offices where? In Chicago and Dallas?
Chicago and Miami, Los Angeles, and we just opened up space, virtual space in Colorado, and soon we will be in New York.
Fantastic. And how do you do this? Do you fly around to all these different places, or you do it all virtually, or you hire other people to follow your lead?
All of the above. So, in the pandemic, we have given up our physical space. And once it's safe to be back in offices consistently, then we will open up physical locations again. But right now, we're all virtual. And I do have really talented clinicians who are in the different locations and who are licensed in the different locations. And then I myself, I'm licensed in Florida, Illinois, soon New York, and then of course California. So I do sometimes do some concierge work in different states, depending on where I'm going. But I live a bi-coastal life, so I go back and forth between California and Florida all the time.
You've got tons of books behind you. You're obviously extremely well read. Give us a sense of the education one needs to get to become a licensed clinical psychologist.
Sure. So when someone wants to become a psychologist, it's usually a 5-year program, 4 or 5 year program for PsyD program. And it can be longer if you take a traditional PhD route. It really depends on whether someone wants more clinical focus or more research focus. But it's rigorous in terms of curricula, and there are different practicum that people learn how to do diagnostic testing, they learn how to do therapy, and then they go on what's called a predoctoral internship, and that completes their education, after which they may choose to do a postdoctoral fellowship where they continue to earn hours toward their licensure, depending on which state they're in. And after that, they're free to sit for the licensing exam and practice.
If people want to access your services, either by just following you on Instagram or checking out your website, where should they go?
Oh, thanks for asking. My website's a great place to start. It's modernintimacy.com. And my Instagram and TikTok account is Dr. Kate Balestrieri. That's Balestrieri.
We're chatting tonight with Dr. Kate Balestrieri, a licensed psychologist and sex therapist. We're going to take a last break and come back with some concluding comments in just a minute. Stay with us.
Okay.
Welcome back. I'm having a really interesting conversation, at least I am enjoying it, with Dr. Kate Balestrieri, who is a licensed psychologist and a sex therapist in Los Angeles, Chicago, and Florida, soon to open in New York. And it's been a really frank and interesting conversation, Dr. Kate. So thank you so much for being so open, and it's been interesting, and I've learned a lot. What's the future, do you think? What's the message that you're trying to provide to people? I saw a really fascinating post again on your Instagram account about a paradigm shift, that sex is not a performance or an indicator of worth. It is a solo or co-created experience of exploration and pleasure. Is that a message that you're trying to get out?
Yes, absolutely. Wholeheartedly. I would love for people to disentangle their relationship to sex from their identity. And I don't mean sexual orientation and the identity that comes with that necessarily, but I mean the quality of sex that I'm having. What does it say about me as a person? I think oftentimes we experience a lot of shame around whether we are having too much sex or not enough sex. Shame about liking certain kinds of sex or not liking certain kinds of sex. And I think it would be a really lovely step forward into the future. And I know there are many sex therapists who feel the same way about this. If we could just continue to challenge shame and sex and really disentangle that, unless of course it's your kink, right? Then shame is great in terms of kink play. But otherwise, making sure that there's really no shaming of your own sexual interests, desires, behaviors, or those of others, right? And whatever your choices can be, they don't have to dictate the lives of other people. I would say the one caveat I would offer there is that, of course, consent is assumed in this conversation.
Right.
Anything that's not consensual is not falling under this umbrella that I'm talking about here. But when we're talking about fantasies, when we're talking about interests, when we're talking about consensual play, let's disentangle shame and really just give permission for people to have a relationship with sex that feels right for them, and stay in our own lane and our own preferences around sexual behavior, and stop making it a condemnation of someone's personal worth or character if they have beliefs about sex that are different than yours.
You've got a lot of comments about misogyny.
Mm-hmm.
Tell me about, are you worried about this? Is it an issue?
It's a huge issue. Yeah. So misogyny is, it's a really dangerous mindset, and it's very prevalent, and it's in a branch of sexism and the oppression of women. So when we talk about misogyny, it really speaks to a hatred of women or a hatred of all things feminine. And it shows up in really insidious ways, and slut shaming and sex blaming are a big part of that. So, when we start to dismantle the double standards, why is it okay for men to be casually sexual, but women, it's not okay? This is an example of misogynistic thinking that has embedded itself in the cultural framework and tapestry that we live in. So when we can start saying, well, why do I believe that? Why isn't it okay for women to be sexual? How did I come to believe that truth? We can really start to examine, all of these messages that of either internalized or externalized misogyny that exist, and guide a lot of what we do in this world.
Why does intimacy require courage?
Well, because intimacy is really about being known and letting yourself be known. And with that comes risk, right? Risk of judgment, risk of rejection, risk of abandonment, risk of criticism. So it requires great strength and great courage to say, here's how I am. All
Dr.
of my
Kate,
spots and stripes.
Dr. Kate Balestrieri, clinical psychologist and sex therapist. Thank you so much for spending an hour with us tonight. Really appreciate it.
I've really enjoyed this talk. I appreciate it.
Remind us again the Instagram account we can go to, or the website.
So my Instagram and TikTok are Dr. Kate Balestrieri, DrKatebalestrieri, and my website is modernintimacy.com.
Well, that's our show for tonight. It was kind of a stimulating one, at least an interesting one. I should be careful with my choice of words. And I'm on every Monday through Friday at 6 o'clock on 960 AM, or you can stream me online at www.saga960am.ca. All my podcasts and videocasts are available on briancrombie.com. The videos are on YouTube, on Facebook, on Instagram, and LinkedIn, and all my podcasts are available wherever you can get podcasts: Apple Podcasts, Audible, Speakeasy, etc. Thanks for joining me. Please join me again. Dr. Kate, what a pleasure. Thank you so much.
Thank you.